Good evening and welcome to Behind the Headlines. Today is Wednesday, the 23rd of August. I'm joined by my good friend and co-host Simon Barrett, and we're this evening going to be having a special review of the biggest news stories that we've covered on Behind the Headlines up to this point this year. Here we are now at the end of August almost. We're well more than halfway through the year, and it's always good, and it has been our custom on Behind the Headlines to basically every half year do a review of the biggest stories and to then have the rest of the time to set that in context of what's to come.
I mean, putting this in context for our viewers as well, because this studio has been closed down for 3 weeks, and all of us, most of us, I think, are having a 3-week break from being on air. It gives us a good time to kind of reflect back on some of the key prophetic and news stories that have dominated the news in 2023 as we interpret it from a Christian perspective, and seek to go beyond the news headlines of the day. But it also is a fresh reminder that we are then ready when we start again recording programs for Wednesday the 30th of August to give kind of fresh material and see what's happening then as we go into the later stage of 2023. So it's been an extremely eventful year. It has some events that have occurred that have a huge prophetic significance. I suppose there are two stories that are really been dominating our headlines this year like any other year. I mean, the first one, we're not going to start with this one, but if we look at kind of themes running through the year, we have the introduction really of AI technology, with warnings that this could destroy civilization. We have moving towards closer to a digital currency in a cashless society, of course in fulfilment of biblical prophecy. We have the great story that we'll be covering later on this one on the 5 Red Heifer cows in Israel that could be used as part of the temple sacrifice for the temple, for the cleansing of the priests, the Levite priests, ready for the rebuilding of the third temple in Jerusalem, as prophesied in the Bible would happen in the last days. We've got the discussion on aliens as well, with the senior security personnel in the US Pentagon actually coming out and saying that there is evidence of alien life form and UFOs, and it's only a question of time before the US government comes out and announces such. So we're talking about these prophetic events. Israel has constantly been in the news during 2023. So is the Iranians. But let's start off one of the first stories we covered really, and this is with this new Israeli coalition government that came into place in January. That Netanyahu finally formed his coalition, and then we've also seen that increase in persecution against Christians in Israel by extreme hardline religious Jews, which is a shame.
You're exactly right, and this shouldn't come as any surprise. This is something that when we've had extremists from various religions, whether Jewish or other, there generally is an attack against followers of Jesus Christ, and it doesn't excuse the acts against Christians at all. At the same time, there has to be that context that's there of the massive amounts of anti-Semitism that many Jews have been hurt by around the world, at times tragically in the name of Christ, at times historically tragically by people professing and to follow the Jewish Messiah. It's inexplicable, but it has happened. And so there was, with this new government, this introduction really of, in some ways, some have looked at it as almost like a legitimization of crackdowns against those who are not religious, or in the scenes that we saw of attacks on Christian cemetery, other attacks against Christians across the land. It's something definitely we need to be looking out for and praying into.
Also, we also unpacked during 2023 the headlines that made the news that the government of Israel is to ban the sharing of the gospel and making it a 1 or 2 year, I think a 2-year criminal offence, and anyone preaching the gospel to minors, that would be a 10-year offence. We kind of unpacked really what was going on behind that. We discovered this was 2 members of Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition party that always introduce this legislation at the start of every Knesset, but the difference being this time that they were actually members of Benjamin Netanyahu's government, and this is why Christians around the world, particularly in the United States, took this story so seriously. But share with us how, for example, the Iranian regime we covered back in February was stepping up its terrorist activities against Britain and the West.
Well, we've seen Iran continuing its nuclear program. Any deal has been completely ridiculous, really, when we consider that this is going on, that there's an expectation that we can reach some sort of armistice deal with Iran, and that keeps them from a further development of their nuclear program. But we reported a deadly shipment of uranium that was discovered at Heathrow Airport, destined for Iranian nationals living in the UK. And the idea and the investigation seems to reveal that the intent for this was to carry out a dirty bomb attack or a nuclear assassination in Britain. Thankfully, we were able to see our security forces stopped that from happening. As the story broke, the Iranian regime then executed Ali Reza Akbari, an Iranian British national accused of spying, which then saw James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, withdraw temporarily the British ambassador in Tehran. So definitely we're going to see going forward in the rest of the year, Iran will continue to play an important role in the global scene, and there's no sign of let up, despite mass protests, which we've also covered over the past year or so. Mass protests are seemingly having no impact on transforming the Revolutionary Guard and the current regime.
And then the other topic that we've been following very, very closely is the kind of Ukraine war. Back in April of 2021, we did programs on how Putin is amassing and deploying a huge number, thousands of troops on the Ukrainian border ready for attack. No one believed us, but you can go back to see previous editions of the Behind the Headlines to see that we were giving a warning that Putin was going to invade Ukraine. And this is the program that we did to mark the first anniversary of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. Joined by Major Retired Rhett Parkinson, who is the Director of the Armed Forces Christian Union, a good friend of mine and always an absolute pleasure to interview. Rhett, warm welcome to Behind Headlines.
Thank you, Simon. Pleasure as always.
And Rhett, what is your perspective on the war in the Ukraine as we mark the first anniversary of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine? And just give us a little bit of a perspective from your military experience and know-how.
Well, who'd have thought here in the 21st century, a little over a year ago, that we would be facing a major conflict in Europe once again. And it's really significant. The scale is quite overwhelming. Even the current front line is nearly 1,000 kilometers long between the Russians and the Ukrainians. And something in the order of 2,000 plus tanks have reportedly been destroyed. But that shows the scale of the conflict that we've seen. The casualty figures are horrific, almost sort of First World War scales. And here we are, looking at a major armoured conflict in Europe, which has played itself out over the last 12 months.
Right. Have you been surprised by the Ukraine's military force and its effectiveness against what was initially put forward as a far superior Russian army?
Yes and no. I think it's clear the Ukrainians are fighting for their survival, fighting for their country, fighting ultimately for democracy and freedom. Putin has clearly underestimated them, and I think somewhat sort of perhaps naively expected to just roll through the borders and up to Kiev and take over the whole country in a relatively unopposed way. I did hear or speak to somebody who chatted to the Ukrainians. All the intelligence a year ago was the Russians were going to invade. and the Ukrainians were initially caught by surprise. And the Ukrainian officer said, well, of course, we worked out, particularly after the invasion of Crimea and the fighting in the Donbass since 2014, how to counter the Russian threat. And we'd worked out that we would stop them before they got to Kyiv. Unfortunately, nobody passed that information to Putin, and all the people in his immediate circle appear to have agreed with him that this would be a swift campaign.
The situation has developed, and indeed you could say escalated even since that point, Simon, where now we see Russia is increasingly on the back foot. Ukraine is pushing, regaining lost territory, and even encroaching so far as to send drones to attack Moscow. So this is definitely a war that's going to drag on a while yet, I'm afraid. Now, another big story that we've been dealing with on Behind the Headlines this year has been in relation to AI. First of all, we asked what lies behind Tony Blair's ongoing, how often has this guy brought up digital ID, but this particularly was a resurrection. He re-emerged into the relevance of our discussion and our nation's life by once again advocating for digital identification cards, and it raises serious concerns, the whole concept regarding our civil liberties. Blair, together with former leader of the Conservative Party, not very conservative action this, by the way, William Hague, proposed the creation of a digital ID that every UK citizen would have on their smartphones. This would include our passports, our driving license, tax records, qualifications, health records, all in one central place. And of course, this is marketed as convenient and great, improve online safety, make it harder for illegal immigrants to get work, and thus stop illegal immigration to the country. But the reality, as we go a bit deeper, is it's far more sinister in its makeup, the foundation it lays. We were able to link that through to how, this might look on the surface, well, it's just an ID card, it's just a digital ID card. There are things that could result as part of that in unprecedented state surveillance on our lives, leading to some of those other areas we've spoken of, kind of a state system not dissimilar from what's experienced in China. We also addressed the increasing dangers of artificial intelligence. We discussed massive increase and influence of the use of AI in day-to-day life and how this will impact our workforce. AI technology could replace 20% of the workforce as it can perform complicated tasks once thought to be only capable by humans. The introduction even of things like ChatGPT, which is an AI script writing software, has been used already to pass exams, write essays, deliver sermons even, and give relationship advice. Although, Simon, I do have to say, I went on ChatGPT and I had a research project I was looking at and stuff, historical project, and it gave me, this is scary, it gave me book titles, authors, and full quotes by these authors in these book titles that were totally non-existent. I double, triple, and quadruple checked. I went to the British Library for some of them, and where it gave me a page number, the book where it was accurate, non-existent quote. When I pushed back, it apologized. So yeah, there's some troubling things afoot in this.
Yeah, also we mentioned in that program as well the introduction of robots that are controlled and monitored like Terminator through AI technology. So let's have a look at this previous recording of Behind the Headlines, looking at this warning in which Tony Blair is recommending that we all introduce the digital ID. Tony Blair, together with his counterpart William Hague, announced last week their 40-page document of recommendation, and this was on behalf of the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, under the heading "A New National Purpose innovation can power the future for Britain. Talks about there that Tony Blair's, this is Tony Blair's a third attempt to bring in a national identification card. So as we mentioned that before, he tried to do that when he was Prime Minister, got abandoned in 2010 when the pandemic came as well. He tried to introduce vaccine passports. That failed, and now he's attempting a third time to bring in a digital ID card for every British citizen. But it's not only happening in Britain as well, it's also happening across the European Union as well. And this is the thing though, it's a global agenda, isn't it, to try and bring in a digital ID card. I mean, we already have our passport. We already had a driving license, but they're saying that if we have everything in one central place on our smartphones or on our tablets, then this will make it easier to access government services, that we'll have all our records in one place, be easy to find. If we need to get any benefits from the government, then that's in one central place, we'll be able to get it. And it's all been sold to us on, this is convenient and it will make our lives easier.
But as I said, it's already happening. I mean, officially, according to the government, I'm now a pensioner, okay? So when I went through the process of applying for my state pension, I had to go through a questionnaire over the phone with someone. But they were able to pull in details from my passport record and my details from the DVLA, which are already linked together. And it actually took only a few minutes to actually set it all up. So there's a lot of the information is already at hand. It's stored in different locations, but there are government departments that can already access this. Yeah. So we're already moving in a direction. And what Tony Blair and William Hague are proposing, again, as I said before, is more a centralization of what already exists. Because my health records are accessible online, okay? That means they're sitting on a computer somewhere. So again, you start linking all of these systems together with, this, well, I suppose artificial intelligence software that allows it to communicate and pull information in from all these sources. It's insidious. Yeah. The way very slowly, gradually, we're already building towards what these guys are proposing. But these guys then come along and make the proposal, and all of a sudden, it makes some of us stop and think, oh my goodness, is this where we really want to go with this? Is this where we want to see this nation go with this? And that's what we need to be aware of.
No, this was not a reverse scenario of a Curious Case of Benjamin Button. That is not me there. That is our good friend Robin Benson, who was filling in for me very kindly, I think, while I was in Israel back in February, March. It was still cold. Everyone's wearing a jumper there. I was enjoying some sunshine, so that was okay. But we've had loads of anniversaries this year, and it's always right that we commemorate significant anniversaries. One of these in particular that we want to remind you of is the fantastic 80th anniversary of the Dam Busters raid. That was a very special moment to commemorate.
Richard Downs, who was a former chaplain to the British Armed Forces in Germany. Richard, it's an absolute pleasure that you can join us on Behind the Headlines, particularly coming from Germany. Can you share with us the role that you've played in being a chaplain to our armed forces, particularly those who are serving out in Germany?
Yeah, certainly. Well, hello everyone, and it's a great pleasure to be on this show. I'm a retired Army chaplain. I served in the Army as a chaplain for 25 years, although my faith came alive as a soldier sometime before that. So I was a soldier for 10 years, then trained for the ministry, 6 years as a civilian, and then back into the Army. And so my total Army service is 35 years. So it's been my life, really. And I love soldiers. My duties have taken me to a variety of places, both in wartime and in peace. So I've served in both Afghanistan, Iraq, Kosovo, 3 tours of Northern Ireland. So I've seen the rough and the smooth of Army life and supported families through those challenges. But it's also been a great delight to be involved in evangelism and helping soldiers find that faith. And it's actually a particular delight is that 3 service personnel or the families, are now ordained ministers, which is really exciting. So yeah, I've had quite a long and varied career.
Amazing. Great to hear your story there, Richard. As you know, we're marking the 80th anniversary of one of the most audacious and well-known, probably, air raids of the Second World War, the famous Dam Busters, and most of us of a certain age have seen the film. The operation to take out 3 major dams in the industrial heartland of Nazi Germany. What are your thoughts, Richard, on the Dam Busters raid and why it has captured the heart and the imagination of the British public for 80 years?
It was an extraordinary, brave and audacious piece of military heroism, I would say. And the theme of the Dam Busters is so well known. In fact, actually, it's been used as one of our church hymns. It's so well known. And the story of the Dam Busters as well. I think everyone has heard of the bouncing bomb, probably thinks of something looking like a football, but it was a lot more complicated than that. And I think the story of Guy Gibson as such a young commander and the daring do, which is so well captured in that movie from the 1950s, still lives long in the hearts of people. Everyone knows about the Dam Busters, but probably doesn't know actually exactly what happened.
And Richard, share with us how back in 2013, a decade ago, you personally became involved with the last survivor of the Dam Busters raid, Johnny Johnson, and how you actually invited him to Germany. Share us the story.
Yeah. It's an extraordinary story, actually, and it goes back to the fact that I'm really rubbish at receiving presents. Normally, when my family give me presents, I put them to one side, say thank you very much at the time. But one Christmas, so Christmas of 2012, my wife gave me a whole set of paperbacks about the Second World War, and I actually read them. And the one that really captured my imagination was the Dam Busters raid by John Sweetman. Now, at that time, we were planning what was called a soldier and community course, so a moral education course for soldiers in Germany. And we had our retreating conference center was the place that we were going to hold this course, a place called Church House in Lübeck am Minden. And when we approached the conference center to look for dates, they said, well, the only available date is the 16th, 17th of May. And lo and behold, we discovered that that was the anniversary of the Dam Busters raid. And then just before that, I received a phone call out of the blue from, I can't remember his name now, but a member of Alpha to the Forces, a former RAF airman, who was having dinner with Johnny Johnson, the last surviving Dam Buster. And he said, would there be any chance of making a link with what we were doing with our moral education of soldiers? And so he, on our behalf, invited Johnny to come out to Germany. Johnny couldn't, but in the end, he gave a bespoke interview, video interview of his experiences. He was the last surviving Dam Buster. And so I just felt the Lord was behind this, putting this book in my hand, giving us a date for a course that coincided with the Dam Buster raid, and then putting us in touch with the last surviving Dam Buster. And so I think he perhaps had some plans. And actually on that course, 13 soldiers who came on it expressed an interest in the Christian faith. And so really it was a real blessing.
That's amazing. It's a really interesting story there. Richard, I'm sure our viewers would love you to share also the strategic reason why the RAF decided to bomb these 3 major German dams, knowing that the total destruction it was going to cause if they were able to pull off this major operation. I suppose it's quite controversial, but very necessary.
Yeah, no, it is indeed. And I later became the warden of Church House Germany and developed the capability of taking soldiers to these battlefield sites and telling the story and helping them recapture some of the moral challenges that servicemen go through today because of military service. Going back to 1943, the Dam Busters Raid, or Operation Chastise as it was called, was the closest thing to precision bombing, and it was really hoped that by attacking those dams that it would bring the war to an early conclusion. But the preparation or the desire to attack German war industry, especially the dams, goes all the way back to 1937, even before the World War began. So contingencies were being put in place to how to prevent or at least to shorten the war.
And that was so important there to mark the 80th anniversary of the famous Dam Busters raid that marked a turning point in the Second World War. And the bomber crew of those incredible Lancasters did what everyone thought was impossible. And so therefore we also discussed the devastation caused there, and that was also with Alistair. So really appreciate Alistair in that programme. Now, one of the other programmes we discussed was of huge prophetic significance for 2023, and that was the arrival of the 5 red heifer cows to Israel, and how they are getting ready to go into a location in Shiloh where the Ark of the Covenant first rested. So what was so interesting about this program, I think, Regan, was the fact that here we are for the first time in Israeli history, I think for over 2,000, maybe 3,000 years. I probably got that wrong, but there was the introduction that these red heifer cows could be used as part of the cleansing sacrifice on behalf of the high priests outside of the city walls, somewhere in the vicinity of the Mount of Olives, in preparation for cleansing themselves for temple worship, which signifies really the rebuilding of the third temple as prophesied in the Bible.
Yeah, and definitely I think we do need to recognize even the trajectory that Israel is on at the moment could very well lend itself to a fairly speedy building of a third temple and inauguration of these customs and rituals from the Old Testament. Now, we reminded viewers that, of course, in Jesus Christ, He's the one who purifies us. But the reality is we will see a return of the old law and the Jewish rituals in the lead up to Christ's return and the full redemption of this broken humanity. So we did discuss that. The ashes of the red heifers are used as part of a cleansing process. They're necessary for the purifying of Jewish priests in temple worship. And according to the Temple Mount Institute, many preparations for the third temple are already in place. There are sacred instruments for worship, priestly garments that can only be worn by members of the Levite tribe as well. And over 500 young Jewish men belonging to the tribe of Levi have been trained to serve as priests in the temple.
And also we found that in September 2022, 5 unblemished red heifer cows arrived in Israel from Texas, and the farmer responsible for bringing these red heifers to Israel was a Christian, so there's huge significance there. And now in a secret location, these red heifer cows are bred in Texas, are a vital component in temple worship in Jerusalem, and could signify the coming rebuilding of the third temple in fulfillment of biblical prophecy. So let's have a look at an extract of the program that we recorded a couple of months ago on the significance of the 5 red heifers in Israel.
What's very critical about this, and them thinking that these are the red heifers that are needed, is that they seem to be in keeping with what the Mosaic Law requires. It specified that the red heifer was to be without defect or blemish, a reminder there from Numbers, and that they will never have borne a yoke, that they will have never been used for any work. The sacrifice of the red heifer was unique in the law in that it used a female animal. It was sacrificed away from the entrance of the tabernacle, meaning this is the sort of thing, if any viewer is thinking, oh, this would spark World War III or something if anyone tried to sacrifice a red heifer on the Temple Mount. This doesn't have anything to do with the Temple Mount. This has everything to do with the priesthood and has everything to do with the ongoing hope of the Jews to see a third temple rebuilt. And so they can do this and would do this outside the city, outside the city of Jerusalem, as it has to be outside the camp of the people. This was to be done by Eleazar the priest, originally there in Numbers, overseeing the ritual. He was the son of Aaron. You'll remember that Nadab and Abihu, the other sons of Aaron, were killed when they offered up strange fire before the Lord. Their sacrifice was to the Lord, but it was not acceptable worship. It wasn't something he had regarded or required or requested. So Eleazar then is the one who is supposed to sprinkle this blood, some of it towards the front of the tabernacle 7 times. Then he leaves the camp again. So that part, he takes the blood. It's sacrificed outside the camp. He takes the blood and throws some towards. Now we could see this being attempted there on the Temple Mount in some way. Then he left again and oversaw the burning of the carcass of the red heifer. As the red heifer is burned, the priest was then to add some cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet wool to the fire. And the ashes are then collected. They're stored in a ceremonially clean place outside the camp, used in the water for cleansing. So the ashes are actually mixed with the water that is used for cleansing, that's viewed as the water of cleansing for purification from sin. But again, we reiterate, as followers of Yeshua as Messiah, then we believe that Jesus has accomplished that purification from sin once and for all time.
Absolutely. I mean, prior to this program, I always looked to Yeshua as being the unblemished lamb that was sacrificed during Passover, and didn't really kind of draw the significance between the red heifers and Yeshua's sacrifice on the cross. But there is a correlation. It says here that the commands concerning the red heifer were yet another foreshadowing of the sacrifice of Christ for believers' sin. The Lord Jesus was without blemish, just as the red heifer was to be. As the red heifer was sacrificed outside the camp, Numbers 19 verse 3, Jesus was crucified outside of Jerusalem, Hebrews 13 1 to 12. And just as the ashes of the red heifer cleanse people from the contamination of death, so the sacrifice of Christ saves us from the penalty and the corruption of death. An animal sacrifice of any type required today, because we know that Jesus fulfilled all the requirements of the law, and his sacrifice alone provides true forgiveness of sin and eternal life. But it's interesting to read what Hebrews chapter 9 verses 11-14 say on this issue. It says, "But Christ came as a high priest of the good things to come, with the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is, not this creation, not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood. He entered the most holy place once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. For if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer, sprinkling the unclean, sacrifices for the purifying of the flesh, how much more so the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to cleanse to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God." And it's quite extraordinary as well that Jesus is also, Yeshua, returning to the Mount of Olives, and this is where the Temple Institute have found a location of where to carry out the ritual of the burning of the red heifers as well. So we're seeing so much symbolism, and this is so symbolic as well, that this really does have kind of prophetic and biblical significance for our time.
100%, Simon. And it's fascinating. Anyone who is slightly not fully certain of all of this and the significance of it, I really encourage you maybe sometime to take a trip to Jerusalem, and just to look at the layout of it, look at how everything is situated, and consider these truths, consider the Scripture's teaching even while there. It brings it all to life. And you'll see in the Mount of Olives, there are multiple tombs. There are multiple tombs of the prophets. Many of the prophets are buried there. I believe a couple of the kings.
Zechariah's tomb is huge.
Yeah.
Down as you go down through the road past the old city, up to the Mount of Olives, there's that huge tomb of Zechariah. But also this signifies as well
stand on the Mount
is that a few Christians don't actually believe there will be a literal third temple. And I think what we are proving through this program today is that yes, there will be a literal third temple being rebuilt, and the Antichrist will defy that temple, and it will become the place of desolation before God. So we know that for Jesus to return to rule and reign, then in Jerusalem, then this third temple has to be rebuilt.
It's there throughout the prophetic witness. It's there in the New Testament when Jesus is speaking concerning the signs of the times. He speaks very clearly of an abomination of desolation. This is after the original abomination of desolation, which was during the days of Antiochus Epiphanes, when, of course, the Greeks took over and then eventually were cast out by God's grace by the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees. It's incredibly important to recognize everything in its historical context. Jesus is speaking in a future way of an abomination, and that it's going to parallel. Antiochus was setting himself up as a god. The Antichrist, the man of lawlessness, will set himself up as a god, and people will follow him. So we've not had that situation wherein we've seen those boxes checked. I would say, and some people out there, you may be viewing and say, no, haven't you heard of preterism? I've heard of preterism. I think it's completely false in much of its statements that it makes, saying that the signs of the times and everything in Revelation was fulfilled in the first century with the destruction of the temple. Don't see it at all. I'm going to say that very, very clearly because I think it has severe ramifications then for what our expectations are, how we live our lives today as followers of Jesus Christ. We do not see someone after whom the whole world has followed, after whom people, regardless of their profession of faith in various things, have looked to as the Messiah, who is a unifying influence. Nero was not the Antichrist. He was a man of lawlessness. He was Antichrist, but he was not anywhere near, in anyone's book, Roman, Jew, other Gentile or anything, a Messiah character. He was routinely hated by everyone. So, let's just clarify that in its biblical context. But Simon, what's so exciting about this is that if we are looking at everything playing itself out toward a point of time that we can actually, I think, chart certain events as they've been happening and as they're happening is laying a foundation toward that fulfillment of what will occur prior to the coming again of Jesus.
No, absolutely. So really seeing that these incredible 5 red heifers, if they still remain unblemished, could actually be used for the first time in thousands of years for Passover 2024, and that's not very far away, that's less than a year away, and we haven't seen anything like this happen in over 2,000 years. Truly remarkable, and this is another major prophetic milestone to know that the return of Jesus Christ is soon. Well,
of further significance, on a completely different note, aliens. You see it in the papers. I don't know about you guys, but growing up in the United States, would every now and then see these magazines and these newspaper headlines with sensational stories. And at the time as a child, I thought they were real, but I then realized that this is just a crank paper. And it was always recording, UFO sightings and people being sucked up into some beam of light and thrown however far away by it. Anyway, we asked the question: are aliens real, or are they an end times delusion? And we had this discussion, and it's very important that we have it, and that we treat it with a degree of respect and seriousness, because there have been articles recently published, not by crank newspapers, but by established and respectable institutions to some degree, making very public statements that aliens have been visiting the Earth for decades. Right. This is U.S. intelligence, former U.S. intelligence personnel. So I don't know if they've had some special technology, scanned over them that impacts their thinking, or if they're just satanically influenced, or what's going on in every way. But we saw that U.S. government scientists were working on spacecraft that they say has non-human origins, and reverse engineering alien technology. Something they've been involved in for some time. Bizarre, but here's the story.
Former members of US security personnel regarding the fact that the United States government has in their possession several alien aircraft, and that American scientists are actually working on reverse engineering on these spacecrafts. And we'll be asking, are aliens true? Or is this part of the end times delusion, as it feels like we are following in the footsteps of Mulder and Scully, the famous 1990s hit series called The X-Files? Regan, it's great to be doing such an interesting topic of you, whether the whole topic of aliens and extraterrestrials and UFOs and what have you. Plays a kind of major part in seems to be playing a major part in end times scenario, as we look and address these serious claims by former US intel agents revealing these remarkable so-called state secrets.
It's always interesting, Simon, that aliens have captivated our culture for so long, going back to the ancients and their stories of gods among men and individuals, supernatural circumstances, often how they're portrayed. I think they, in some ways, were closer to the reality than how this is being portrayed in our modern era. You can think of H.G. Wells, and H.G. Wells was very anti-God, but had quite a few, admittedly, enthralling reads. His War of the Worlds was really incredible, and of course there have been multiple film adaptations, and I think even an opera, a stage opera, built around that book. But there was a reading of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds at one point, wherein people thought the end of the world has come. They actually believed it was a real news bulletin. So that's escalated, and you have Signs, that great, I believe, Mel Gibson film, early 2000s, about aliens. You have A Quiet Place, all sorts. It's captivated the public attention. So people have been asking that question: are we alone? Is anyone out there? And how much money is spent each year by NASA and other space programs, even sending messages out to space in the hope or in the expectation that someone might respond, and that someone out there might respond positively, that we are not alone.
Well, from a humanistic point of view, if we take this, take God out of the equation. I know we can never take God out of the equation because he is the creator of the heavens and the earth. He's the one that created the universe. But if you have a kind of secular humanist mindset, and you see the kind of universe and the mass expanse of universe, it would seem logical from that perspective that in this huge universe that we wouldn't actually be alone, that there would be other life forms on other planets. So when you have that mindset, it's easy then to believe in aliens. It's easy then to believe in unidentified flying objects. It's easy to believe then that the US government has been covering up for the last 8 decades alien aircraft, which is extraordinary. And it's these stories that inspired science fiction. I think my childhood has been dominated by watching kind of the Star Wars movies. So we got Star Wars movies, we got E.T. as well. You know, we've got an incredible film called Aliens, Independence Day, Men in Black, and of course X-Files as well with Mulder and Scully, that used to be a kind of hit series when I was at university in the 90s as well. Have all played a major role in kind of conditioning you know, the culture in the West to believe that there are aliens out there, that there is other life forms out there. But what I think is extraordinary, Regan, is the fact that a number of highly decorated, high-profile US security personnel have recently come out in public and said that they've actually know that the government has what it describes as unhuman craft, or effectively alien aircraft. So this effectively means that we are now in a kind of uncharted waters, as they also think that it will only be a question of time before the US government announces that we're not alone and there is extraterrestrial life forms out there, which is extraordinary. And either this is true, or this is part of the end times delusion in which we'll see the rise of the Antichrist. So, yeah, look.
Well, aliens, we've discussed, and I imagine we'll discuss yet again, but we did conclude that this is demonic, that or in some cases, I still maintain, I think, Simon, that there may be some cases that are angelic, but people that they will assume UFO or alien. But whatever the case, it's in the spiritual realm.
No, absolutely, and it does attract people to watch the program. If you've got a program, do aliens exist, or is this part of the end times delusion? It certainly will attract a different audience. It will certainly attract people that, wow, Christians speaking about these issues. I didn't think they would. So I think these are the kind of things where we're seeing a popular themes. We're seeing really that our own state, particularly the United States, really wanting to kind of test the vibes of the American public regarding UFOs and whether to come out publicly and say that they exist and they have space aircraft they're working on and government scientists and everything else. You can be sure that this is part of a greater plan. And that's why it's important that we touch upon these subjects. And one of the other subjects, the ones I like to do the most, Regan, in terms of behind the headlines, is to look at groundbreaking events and get behind what has actually happened. Of course, we had the program we did called What Lies Behind the Attempted Wagner Coup against President Putin, because we did that program, gives us an opportunity to unpack what's going on, who are the Wagner group, who is the person leading up the Wagner group, how is Putin responding to this. And the fact is that the Wagner group, that are effectively a private army recruited by Putin to fight in the Ukraine, and the leader Prigozhin of the Wagner group was able to recruit prisoners in Russian jails and say, look, I'll give you your freedom in 2 or 3 years if you come and sign up for us. So here we have a private militia force essentially working in Africa, and in terms of protecting regimes in Africa, are given landmines, are given money, arms, everything. So effectively we're seeing this as a kind of private army to hire, then turns on Putin and literally gets to within 80 miles of Moscow, totally unopposed, and then stops. So it's extraordinary.
It definitely was, and was quite jarring for people at the time to observe, but points to the fractures within this ongoing saga that's been extending now past a year. We've seen in the aftermath since then, it seems that most of the Wagner troops have relocated to Belarus. There's still a bit of discussion as to what's going to happen in the long term with Wagner. Prigozhin has been, it seems, back and forth between Belarus and Moscow as well. But here is what we reported on that evening.
Surveillance photos from the French military show Wagner Group mercenaries burying bodies in the African nation of Mali. The Russian private army, known for its atrocities in Ukraine and designated a transnational criminal organization by the U.S. government, has taken its dirty work to Africa, where it's offered its services to a number of governments, expanding Kremlin influence on the continent. Yevgeny Prigozhin's Wagner Group is deployed across several African nations, and officials say where Wagner goes, trouble usually follows. The Wagner Group is in Mali, Chad, Libya, Cameroon, Central African Republic, Sudan, Zimbabwe, Madagascar, and may be moving into Burkina Faso. Wagner offers African leaders a range of services, from disinformation warfare against political opponents to armed protection against insurgencies, to training for their armies, all tying those African leaders closer to Moscow. South African expert Pauline Bax tracks Wagner operations for International Crisis Group.
Wagner is a network of companies. Basically, it's not one single company, and most of these companies are all fall under Yevgeny Prigozhin. They provide private security to the people in power. They take over private businesses or they establish private businesses, and these are often in natural resource extraction, such as mining or logging, for example.
To get around sanctions, Wagner Group takes payment in the form of timber, precious metals, gold, and diamonds. The UN believes Wagner was involved in the massacre of more than 500 people in Mali last year. It's also suspected of committing atrocities in the Central African Republic.
It's basically an organized crime syndicate that is operating on behest of the Russian government.
Retired FBI Special Agent Eric Karen is a security consultant for several African nations.
They're essentially Russia's KGB, operating throughout Africa, committing crimes, committing murder, and stealing resources from precious diamonds and gold and minerals throughout Africa in exchange for security.
U.S. officials also accuse Wagner of using Mali as a base to funnel weapons from Turkey to the Russian military fighting in Ukraine. It's also accused of fueling the war in Sudan by providing advanced weapons systems in a conflict that has displaced an estimated 1 million people.
We are asking external forces to leave Sudan alone.
The problem is that Wagner goes where it's invited.
It's not that Wagner just comes in and rolls into a country and does whatever it wants. It does this with the approval and often the blessing of the ruling elites.
And while Wagner profits, it increases the Kremlin's footprint throughout the continent, pushing the U.S. and Western nations out. Karen says the White House should have paid attention sooner, before the Wagner Group established itself as a major player and a major problem in Africa. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
And we must thank Dale Hurd. We must thank all our friends at CBN for allowing us and giving us the permission to use their excellent news videos, which really does enhance the programs we're doing and really does bring a kind of perspective on some of the big issues that we're talking about that go beyond the headlines of the day. And Regan, I mean, we haven't touched on many of the Israel stories, but we've touched on the raid that Israel carried out recently in Jenin. We've also covered, also very recently as well, unpacking the plans of the Netanyahu government to reform Israel's judiciary and get an understanding of that one. We've discussed also the prospect of Israel facing a multi-front war. And we know that Israel is essentially the apple of God's eye and the centerpiece of God's prophetic time clock. So we have to look at world events within the prism of God, of the biblical understanding of the nation of Israel, because it's through the nation of Israel we see that nations are blessed or cursed, as in kind of reference to Genesis 12, 1-3, that I will bless those who curse you and I will bless those who bless you and I will curse those who curse you. We know that that is a reference to the Messiah, because the Messiah came from the line of David, from the line of Israel, but also means in reference to the Jewish people as well, and also the nation of Israel. And being a news producer, being a broadcast journalist, the one thing I've noticed so much throughout key events taking place in the world is all dependent on whether they are blessing or cursing Israel. It's just absolutely incredible. And God brings in a curse or he brings in a blessing.
Yeah, it's very important to remember. I've been doing some revised study on this recently, and just seeing throughout the scriptures this big subject that's underlying everything. It's God's history. It's His story of dealing with His people. And right from the beginning, you see the trajectory of where He's going to call out of the pagan lands a man to himself and his family. He's going to show them a land. He's going to give him descendants. And you see the two things that primarily encapsulate our speaking of Israel right there, land and descendants. He gives them promises that He will bless, and that through His land and His descendants, all the nations of the world will be blessed. And that's a consistent thread that you see throughout the Old Testament. Is covenant broken? Absolutely. There's covenant broken time and time again by the people of Israel with God, but He continues to work all things out toward a point and place of redemption, eventually bringing all nations into that covenant blessing through Jesus Christ. And there's that promise that at the end there's going to be a remnant as well that return.
Amen. Also, got to say that as we are going to be, 1 minute left of the program. Regan, it's been a pleasure. I think when we come back and do programs in September, this program will be its 3rd anniversary, so which has been amazing. It's been a pleasure.
It's hard to believe it's gone. Where has time gone? It flies when you're having fun, they say. But viewers, thank you so much. It's such a privilege to be here with Simon to present these programs on a week-by-week basis. We hope that it's a blessing to you, that it informs you, that it does truly do what it says on the tin and goes behind the headlines. And so we ask that you would continue to pray for us and continue to support Revelation TV and this program. And we hope that as we go into this latter part of the year, that we'll be able to continue to provide you with that Christian perspective of each of the significant events going on in the world. Bless you all. We'll see you next time on Behind the Headlines.